Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. All the characters in the story who enter into intimate relationships are over 18 years old. About once a month, the school where I work holds a casual wear day. There are rules about what students can wear and what they can't. The rules for girls are stricter than for boys, but that's the way it is. This may not be politically correct, but it makes sense. Despite these rules and the rather strict interpretation of them by the headmistress, some girls always break it. So I wasn't too surprised to see Tiara walking down one of the corridors in an outfit that I was pretty sure was breaking all the rules. What surprised me was that it was lunchtime and Mrs. Fogarty hadn't pulled the tiara out of her pretty socks and sent her home to change. I went down to see Mrs. Fogarty, not feeling the slightest desire to stop the teenager and discuss the choice of clothes with her. "Have you seen the tiara?" I asked Mrs. Fogarty. "Yes, I saw it," she said, giving me a murderous look. It had no effect. The murderous stares bounced right off me. "So what?" I prompted. Mrs. Fogarty tried to look me up and down, but I sat and waited patiently. Eventually, she sighed. I called her over and gently reminded her of the recommendations for casual wear. She politely pointed out that she was 18 and quite capable of deciding for herself whether her clothes met the recommendations or not. According to her, the clothes she was wearing now suited her, and each item corresponded to the recommendations. What else could I say? I took out the manual and started checking what she was wearing. Each item corresponded to the recommendations. She even showed me her panties and bra, and they meet the guidelines. Maybe just because of the thickness of the material, but within the guidelines. Mrs. Fogarty gave me what could only be described as a malicious smile. Of course, if you have specific objections to any of the things she is wearing, I would be very glad to hear it. I spread my hands rather helplessly. If you say that she meets the recommendations, then I assume that the case is closed. It's simple. My voice trailed off as I waved my arms rather helplessly. Is it just that in this case, her entire outfit as a whole is less than the sum of the details? Mrs. Fogarty suggested. I couldn't have put it better myself, I agreed. Doesn't the recommendation say anything about how girls can't look like cheap fools flirting with customers? Unfortunately, no. Skirts should be very long. Tops should not show this or that. Such things should be covered. No one imagined that you could wear what we allow and still look like a tiara. What's worse, she's a great lawyer. If I had sent her home to change just because I didn't like her outfit, she would have challenged it by waiving instructions and threatening to go to the media. You know how they'll jump at something like this if there's not much news on the news. I nodded thoughtfully. You're right about something, I admitted. And yet, as much as I hate it, I will whisper a gentle word into her shell-like ear, hinting that a small change in her outfit would be nice. I'm officially telling you this so she can't come screaming about harassment. I didn't immediately rush to look for the tiara. I just made a mental note to talk to her when our paths cross. I casually strolled around the school grounds, restraining any excessively noisy behavior with my presence, generally observing what was happening. I finally saw Tiara walking around everywhere. She swayed her hips, causing her skirt to bounce slightly when walking, which, combined with a light breeze, meant that panties flashed from time to time, which was contrary to school rules, but was difficult to provide. As Tiara waltzed, she caught the guys' eyes on her here and there, throwing them looks that could only be described as, "I know you want me," gloating about how she was being watched. After a while, I realized where she was going and put myself in a position where our paths would cross. "Good morning, Tiara," I said, greeting the girls with a general nod in their direction. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, grinning. I ignored it. I could see that she was waiting for me to make some comment about her clothes. I am far from disappointing her. "Tell me, Tiara, if you saw a man dressed in a police uniform, would you assume he was a policeman?" "It's either that or he's going to a costume party," she replied. "That's a reasonable point," I agreed. "I suppose you'd think the same of someone dressed like a firefighter?" She silently nodded in agreement. "And if someone is dressed like a cheap fool?" There was a slight murmur among her companions, shocked by my conclusion. "How can you tell by the clothes if a woman is a fool?" Tiara asked. "Of course, is it more in her behavior than in her clothes?" "You could say the same thing about a policeman," I said. You're not going to a party right now, are you? And what do you mean by that? Nothing. Just curious. While answering, I also ran my gaze over her, and she blushed. Just out of curiosity. How do you manage to fight off guys? I noticed they were watching you. I can handle the boys here, she said scornfully. Anyway, it's all just talk. Unless you run into a football team, I said thoughtfully. Then you might have a problem. Tiara blushed and looked like she'd had enough of our conversation and wanted to go her own way. I waved at her as I passed, making one last little comment as she left. I wouldn't worry too much. The jury no longer resorts to the "she asked for it" argument. I immediately forgot about the tiara. She was Mrs. Fogarty's problem, not mine. I was doing my usual duties. Schools like you to be busy with something. I remembered her and her strange outfit when I noticed her right after the school bell ended. She was walking in the direction of the sports grounds. I caught myself moving faster than usual and hurried to stop her. "Tiara," I said, stepping onto the path in front of her. She had to stop. Students do not push rudely past teachers, even if the last bell has rung. "What? What is it?" she asked, somewhat ungraciously. "Are you still confident in your ability to handle boys?" I asked. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, I just noticed that Brandon is a brute, an extraordinary football player, and 3 of his henchmen are watching you. They seem to be watching you quite closely. However, if you're sure you can handle them..." At that moment, Brandon and his friends walked slowly past, taking one last look at the tiara. They also cast rather loose glances at her. Tiara watched them go, looking a little shocked. After a few moments, she was even more shocked. "Oh my God." They stopped. "They're waiting behind those bushes ahead." "Bushes are useful things," I said. "I remember disappearing behind some bushes with my girlfriend when I was your age. They hide a lot of wrongdoing, and the bushes do it. Well, I'd better let you go your own way. I'm sure you have an appointment that you don't want to miss." I cast a meaningful glance at the boys, and then ran my eyes over the tiara, letting her see my fun. "Wait," she exclaimed. "Oh, could you wait a minute? Can you get the boys to leave?" "They didn't do anything wrong," I said. "They're just standing there talking. If I talk to them, they will just say that they have a little extra time before starting training." Brandon has a certain reputation," Tiara said slowly. She was right. A rather unpleasant case. If he wasn't a star player, he probably would have been kicked out of school by now. "Yes, it is," I admitted. "Still, I'm sure you can handle him and his buddies. There are only 4 of them." The poor girl looked so scared that I threw her a lifeline. "I'm going back to my office," I told her. "If you want, you can go and wait for half an hour in my office. By that time, the training will begin, and the path will be clear." I headed back to my office, Tiara trotting beside me, chatting nervously. When I got to my office, I pointed to a chair for her to sit down, and then called on the phone. "Coach? It's Greg. When your training starts, could you do me a little favor? I want you to take Brandon and those 3 idiots who follow him around and bury them in the ground. Chase them away until they vomit, and then chase them away again. You can tell them that running is a good way to get rid of unpleasant thoughts." "They didn't actually do anything," I answered the coach's question. "This is rather an example of what they intended to do if I hadn't taken certain steps to circumvent the situation. The young lady would be involved in this matter, albeit reluctantly. I'm going to kick a young lady's ass on the school playground for being an idiot." "Thanks," I said. Hanging up, the coach would have enjoyed putting Brandon and the company out of action. Maybe they would have understood this message. "What do you mean, you're going to kick my ass?" Tiara demanded. "In a way," I said, leaning back in my chair and examining her. "Let's look at your behavior today. You came to school dressed like a cheap fool." "I know," I said when she tried to interrupt me. "Everything you're wearing is in accordance with school rules. You played a cheap lawyer's joke by pointing that out. Strictly speaking, you're right. Practically speaking, you're still dressed like a cheap fool. I bet your parents didn't see this outfit before you left. Judging by the nasty look I got, I'd guess I was right about her parents. I wonder how your father will react when he sees a photo I took of you flirting with boys at lunch. I would love to hear his comments." "You won't do that," came a startled scream. I smiled and tapped on my phone. "I haven't sent it yet. It depends on how well we find a solution to your misbehavior." Consider your behavior. You know the school's harassment policy, don't you? This cannot be tolerated. The way you dressed and behaved today could be interpreted as harassment. If someone had made a formal complaint to Mrs. Fogarty, I think she would have been very happy to consider it. You probably would have gotten off with an official warning and a letter to your parents. Tiara was starting to look visibly ill. On top of that, you seem to have been busy all day advertising the fact that you're active, want to spend time, and maybe not too picky. Consequently, Brandon and his friends thought they were on the right track. You do realize that if they dragged you into the bushes and raped you, most of the school would believe that you were compliant. In fact, she was asking for it. It wasn't like that, Tiara protested. I was just having a little fun breaking the rules and teasing the boys. Maybe so, but it's not what you meant. It's how other people perceive your behavior. They interpreted it in their own way, hence Brandon's interest. We have established rules for your protection. You bend and break them. Bad things can happen. We must be vigilant to protect you from your own stupidity. That's why we punish violations. It's better to have a controlled punishment than to let you get into something that could be really bad. So what are you going to do? I guess you're not going to literally kick me around the school grounds. No, no kicking. I'm just going to suggest that you take off your panties and lift up your skirt. What? Have you ever heard a scream in a whisper? That's what Tiara's question was like. If you pull up your skirt in front, I'll lean you back against my desk and take you. If you pull up your skirt from behind, I'll bend you forward over my desk and spank you. The decision will be in your hands. Oh, really? And what happens if I refuse to lift my skirt at all? I'll know that you're a naive little virgin who has no idea who she's invited. In that case, I'll turn you over to Mrs. Fogarty to discuss your behavior with your parents. Like hell you would. I would tell her what you just asked me to do. Won't it cause problems? For you. You don't really think she'll believe you, do you? Young ladies in trouble always make accusations of harassment. It's a little hard to handle when you're being accused of harassment yourself in front of dozens of witnesses to every boy in school. I leaned back in my chair, completely relaxed. I didn't doubt Tiara's decision. I mean, an attractive 18-year-old student came face to face with an unpleasant-looking, arrogant teacher who was almost twice her age. She would have run, not walked, to the nearest exit. And the fact that the exit was marked Mrs. Fogarty would not have mattered in the slightest. You can imagine my feelings when she stood up, gave me a defiant look, and began to pull off her panties, stuffing them into the pocket of her dress. With a huge effort of will, I kept my jaw from hitting the ground. She must have been bullying me. She had another surprise for me. Instead of pulling up the dress from the front or back, I would have assumed from behind, and I was wrong again. She pulled it up at the sides, lifted it, and tucked it into her belt, remaining naked from the waist down. The little bun of curls she had, although strategically arranged, hid nothing. I take it this is your subtle way of telling me that you're not a virgin, I muttered. Tiara blushed, but did not back down. She raised her head to look at me and didn't cover herself with her hands. I got up and walked over to her side of the table, and she watched me the way a hawk watches a mouse. Or maybe that's how a mouse watches a hawk. I couldn't be sure. I reached past her, dragged the chair she was sitting on to the middle of the room, and sat down on it. Then I patted my knee, looking at her and smiling. What are you going to do? What you asked me to do. It seems that you want both spanking and making love. In that case, it seems to me that it is probably best to start with a spanking, since this means that later we can end on a high note. How high depends on whether you're a screamer or not. Tiara blushed even more. She suddenly seemed much more shy to me, and her hands finally dropped to cover herself. You don't seriously think I'm going to let you spank me, and then, you know? She said. So, now you're saying you're a virgin? I asked with an exasperated sigh. What? No. I'm just saying that you can't really spank me. I mean, you just can't. I can't? I'll tell you what. You're leaning over my knee, showing. No. I mean, you're not allowed to do anything like that. From what Mrs. Fogarty said, you're 18. This means that you are able to give consent. If you lean over my knee, I have the right to think that you agree. Anyway, to the spanking. But the school rules, she muttered. Are you worried about school rules now? I'm pretty sure they don't say anything about teachers spanking naughty young ladies. Not that I've ever checked. I don't think I'll check it in the future either. Ignorance is bliss. Um, I really think maybe I should let you report me to Mrs. Fogarty and pick up whatever she's cooking. I quite understand. It's just too embarrassing to get your ass slapped, right? It's easier to cut and run. That's not the point. I'm not afraid of being spanked. It's just that then you could try, like you said. Then why don't you just take turns doing it all? Step 1 is to bend over and get spanked. Step 2 is to tell the truth about whether you are a virgin or not. The third step is to decide whether you are going to make good love or not, depending on the answer announced in the second step. You mean if I admit that I'm a virgin, you won't want to, initiate me? It was eloquent. This may mean that I will only take you if you are a virgin. Your best bet is to tell the truth and decide if you want me to continue. How do I know you won't try to force me? May I draw your attention to the fact that you're standing there, flaunting your lovely mink and purring, and I didn't even try to stroke it. If I don't knock you to the floor right now and jump on you with lascivious screams, I'm unlikely to do it later. I patted my knee again. Come here. You might as well have done with the spanking by now. Tiara was obviously weighing the relative pros and cons of spanking compared to having to face Mrs. Fogarty. The advantages of an immediate spanking were beginning to outweigh the future Mrs. Fogarty. She sighed and her shoulders slumped a little. Then she moved towards me, resigned to being slapped on the waist. Oh, political correctness? I suggested. According to the latest thoughts on domestic violence, no one is allowed to hit so hard that it can cause pain. The school demands that we follow these rules. This is ridiculous. I totally agree, but rules are rules. I can slap you a little harder if it makes you happier. Tiara made a sound that I took to be agreement, so I slapped a little harder. She was still complaining. You shouldn't have spanked me there. You have to forgive me if I make any small mistakes, I told her. I'm not used to naked young women lashing out at me, demanding to be spanked. I'm sure I'll get better with practice. Oh, why can't I spank you here? You have beautiful curves here, and as you can see, my hand covers those curves quite nicely. Get your hand out of there. I'm not naked and I didn't throw myself at you. You insisted. Not really. I gave you a choice, and you chose this. I demonstrated it by giving her a good slap on the ass. As for the non-naked part, it can be fixed. Would you like to be naked? Maybe that will encourage me to give you a good beating. Assuming that's what you want. Tiara was now squirming, protesting, but somewhat incoherently, not quite knowing what to say. Finally, I lowered my hand, slapping her hard one last time, and set her on her feet. There were tears in her eyes, but she made a determined effort not to cry. Her eyes weren't the only place that suddenly got wet. It seemed to me that if she didn't put on her panties fast enough, she might just start dripping on the floor. Unless something else has time to cover her mound. Tiara was breathing heavily and didn't look at me. This attitude changed when I stood up and loudly unzipped the zipper. The sound of the zipper undoing made her turn around to look at my groin and then at my face, trying to read my intentions. She protested without taking her eyes off me as my hand slipped into my unbuttoned fly, pulling out my erection. Now listen, I agreed to the spanking, but there's no way I'm going to let you do anything. Oh my God, you're kidding me. I suppose I should have felt flattered, but what I honestly felt was surprise. My friend wasn't that big, was he? Not that I've ever had any complaints. Tiara, I said patiently, we haven't even talked about whether you're a virgin or not. Let's figure this out before making any other decisions. I took it out just to give him a little break. It was pretty crowded where he was. I looked at her expectantly. She looked around in confusion. I sighed. Are you going to tell me if you're really a virgin or not? I've already told you that's not the case, she said, blushing. No, you just assumed that. Although I do not know why you are acting so embarrassed, I told her. Losing your virginity undoubtedly means that you've seen something like this before. It was dark, she muttered, not looking at me. Well, it's not dark yet. Here, just hold it and see how it feels. I caught her hand and held it to me. Her hand obediently covered his. Then I shut up, and she just stood there, clinging to me, not knowing whether to let her go or explore her unexpected gift. To my relief, she decided to investigate. Her hand began to move slightly over me, I think, measuring it. Since you have the prize in your hands, I suggested gently, after waiting a few moments, why don't you lean back against the table and point it where you want it to go? This way, you will be in control of the situation and will be able to watch him fall into place. Okay, maybe I took her agreement for granted, but once you assume something like that, it's hard for people to say no. They feel that they must have agreed and are going along with you. My random guess seems to have definitely worked in the tiara case. I saw her swallow and lick her lips. Maybe they were a little dry. Then she slowly backed up to the table, hugging me tightly as she went. Quite naturally, I moved along with her. Either that, or I risk losing a valuable part of my anatomy. Tiara leaned back against the table, spreading her legs beautifully. I settled between her legs, as if I had a choice. She was still holding me, watching her put me in my place. It was clear to me that even if she wasn't a virgin, she wasn't experienced. Despite her clumsiness, she still managed to connect the right parts, and all I had to do was give a little push at the right moment. When I pushed her slightly, she pulled her hands away, not wanting to block her view of what was happening. Her head was tilted forward, her hips were spread, and she really wanted to see what would happen when I entered her. She seemed to hold her breath as I entered. I found that her passage was hot and slippery, waiting for me, and Tiara began to snuggle up to me even before I fully took my place. We made contact with a light slap, and she let out a whistling breath, gasping slightly as she began to breathe again. She continued to watch as I started to do it, pulling away and leaning forward again. Her hips were pushing impatiently towards me. This girl was hot and needy. I found myself suspecting that she could have handled Brandon and his friends if they had managed to catch her, but it was still better that she didn't have to do it. I was a much more worthy target for an upset libido. As soon as I had a pleasant rhythm, I slid my hands up under her blouse. After a while, she raised her head, tipping it back slightly, and closed her eyes. Now she just felt, moving with me automatically, rather than making the deliberate effort she started with. The rhythm I set was not fast, but rather one that would allow me to prolong the meeting. Tiara seemed to have fallen asleep, moving in time with my thrusts, and soft hoarse sighs escaped her lips. I hate to say this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the center of attention in Tiara's mind. It seemed that she was immersed in beautiful daydreams, and the man of her dreams was gently making love to her. Not that it really bothered me, she did amazing things to me. As I mentioned earlier, she may not have had much experience, but she turned out to be either a fast learner or a person with amazing natural talent. Over the next few minutes, I gradually increased the pace. Pretty soon I was entering her with good speed, thoroughly enjoying the feeling of her sweet young flesh curling around me while she snuggled up to me. Clinging is also an appropriate word. She lifted one leg and wrapped it around me, while her hands gripped my shirt, hugging me tightly to her. Now I covered her neck with light kisses, following the curve up, and finally kissed her hard. Our tongues touched as we continued to move as one. It soon occurred to me that Tiara could go on like this all day, just leaning back and enjoying the feeling of worshiping her body. This is not the case for me. I was going to run out of steam pretty soon, and this fact dictated the need for a change of style. I quickened my pace again, and this time significantly. Tiara adjusted well, but it prevented her from focusing on her daydreams. Her mouth left mine, and her eyes flew open wide. She looked slightly shocked. Her ragged gasps turned into desperate screams. I suspect she would have screamed a lot louder if it wasn't for the fact that she remembered where we were. Now I was hitting her hard, and I could feel the tension building in her. She was fascinated by everything that was happening. Not only was my end near, but I was crossing the finish line, starting to twitch helplessly but impatiently, pouring into it. It was enough to push her to the limit, and she was right next to me, letting out a scream through her closed mouth. It sounded pretty weird. We had a somewhat calmer conversation after we cleaned up. Tiara agreed that she might have overdone the clothes and promised that she would send Mrs. Fogarty a written apology. It would make Mrs. Fogarty get rid of her and bring me some fame in her eyes. For my part, I assured her that I would make sure that Brandon backed off if he had any more loose ideas. The coach would be happy to do it. Tiara left quite satisfied. Her mood probably improved because I accompanied her just in case. In case there were any horny young men hanging around. As soon as she left the school grounds and waited at the bus stop with the other girls, I thought I could leave and return to my office. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be a one-off, or if she would be looking for me to repeat. Unfortunately, I could only wait and watch, because it is considered indecent for a teacher to chase a student. Life can be difficult at times. End.